Hello everyone, my name is Teresa Lewis and I'm the Director of the Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Utilization here at the Department of Health and Human Services. I want to welcome you today to the training on how to set aside contracts for women-owned small businesses. Today I'm really excited. We've got the experts from the U.S. Small Business Administration here to provide you with the training and the knowledge. What you may know, I'm sure you already know is that there is a 5% women-owned goal at both the prime and the subcontracting levels. HHS has consistently and historically exceeded that goal. So, without further ado, let me introduce the expert, Aditi Dasal. She's the Senior Advisor in the Government Contracting and Business Development at the U.S. Small Business Administration. Aditi, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for assisting me with providing training.
Teresa, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate the chance to be here and talk about this program that I work on quite a bit. So,
Absolutely.
All right, I'll take it away.
All right, thank you,
Thank
Aditi.
you. So, I'm going to begin by talking briefly about what we're going to talk about today. I'll give a little bit more of an in-depth overview of the WSB contract program and what constitutes an eligible firm, and then I'll spend a lot of time talking about the contracting officer's responsibilities with the program, what the eligibility requirements are and how the contracting officer needs to review those requirements, and the actual nuts and bolts of how to get into the WSB program repository and look at the documents in order to make the contract award to a firm that's eligible. We'll also talk about how the repository works specifically in terms of how to get access to it, how to get help if you're having issues with it, and really work through those different questions that you might have about it as well. And there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end that you can submit through the online platform. So a little bit of background about the program. The WSB program was authorized by Section 8M, which authorizes small businesses or agencies to set aside contracts for women-owned small businesses or economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses. There are a couple of places where you can go read every single word of these different provisions, 13 CFR 127 and FAR Part 19.15. And this authority, as Teresa mentioned, is very important. It allows for greater access to federal contracting opportunities for women-owned small businesses and economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses. So as Teresa mentioned, there's a 5% statutory goal for the women-owned small businesses out there in the federal supply chain, both at the prime and the subcontract level. The purpose of this program was to give contracting officers an additional tool in their toolbox to get more contracts awarded to small businesses that are women-owned small businesses. It's important to consider kind of the landscape of firms out there. There are quite a few small businesses, and women-owned small businesses make up about 30 to 40% of the small businesses out in the United States. And the 5% goal should be fairly attainable with that 30 to 40% of the firms out there being women-owned small businesses. So the government overall has had a challenge meeting that requirement. This past year, we were at about 4.3% for FY12, but that does represent a significant improvement over the past several years. Across the government, we had been hovering around 4% for at least the past 3 or so fiscal years. So to go up to 4.3% for FY13 was a significant step in the right direction. Hopefully this program, as it is better understood throughout the acquisition community as well as the contractor community, will help us get even closer to that 5% goal and then exceed that 5% goal, hopefully in the very near future. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the program itself and the requirements. So the main purpose, again, is to limit competition for contracts to specific industries where SBA has determined that women-owned small businesses are either underrepresented or substantially underrepresented in those industries. So competition for requirements can be restricted to either WOSBs or EDWOSBs, and I'll go into much more detail about what the differences are between those two categories and how to make the determination on what exactly you're doing with a particular acquisition. However, competition is required for all WSB contracts. This is not a sole source authority. So keep that in mind as you contemplate this as a mechanism to do an acquisition. And it's important to note that WOSBs as well as EDWOSBs are required to upload documents into a place called the Wsb Program Repository. That is a system maintained by Sba where their documents that demonstrate their eligibility are made accessible to you as a contracting officer. And it's incumbent upon the contracting officer to take some steps with those documents in order to properly award the contract using this authority. Additionally, the women-owned small businesses are supposed to identify their status in the system for award management. And there are several categories of women-owned small business. Again, I will discuss those over the next few slides. So a big and important feature of this program is that it's for specific industries. So we, SBA, conducted a study to analyze where are women-owned small businesses underrepresented and how can we help women kind of make additional inroads within those industries. And so this study was done a few years ago and concluded that about 360 or so 6-digit NAICS codes are eligible for this program. So that is a very important thing to keep in mind when first considering which acquisition you're going to be doing and which code is the applicable industry code, and then also which firm is a potential offer on this contract, and do they meet the requirements for the codes that apply to them as a firm as well as for the solicitation that is in question. So that limitation by industry is very unique. It's different than the Hub Zone program, it's different than the 8A program, it's different than the SDVOSB program, but it is an important piece of the puzzle in terms of ensuring you are doing the acquisitions in the proper way. So for WSB only contracts, it can be limited to women-owned small businesses if the NAICS code assigned to the solicitation, invitation for bid, or quote is an industry in which SBA has designated that WSBs are substantially underrepresented. In this case, in both cases really, the rule of 2 applies. So your market research needs to indicate that there are 2 WSB firms out there that will allow you to do this award as a WSB set aside. And of course, the contract must be able to be awarded at a fair and reasonable price. So you'll see this a lot throughout the presentation. It's important to remember that an EDWOSB can bid on a WOSB contract, but a WOSB is not eligible to bid on EDWOSB contracts. So I'll say it a couple more times. If it doesn't make sense yet, hopefully it will, and we can probably talk about it more during the Q&A portion if there's anything that's unclear. So similarly, for an EDWSB set aside, the code for the solicitation has to be designated as an industry where EDWSBs are underrepresented. Again, the rule of 2 applies, and the contract still must be able to be awarded at a fair and reasonable price. So, and again, that reminder that WOSBs are not eligible to bid on EDWSB contracts. So what does that oh, sorry. So in terms of contract award amounts, when this program was first implemented in 2011, there were caps on the dollar amount of contract, or the dollar value of the contract that could be set aside using this authority. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2013 authorized the removal of those caps, and SBA was able to move pretty quickly to offer or to release a rule removing those caps, and the FAR followed very shortly thereafter, I believe in June of 2013, where the FAR also removed the caps on the program. So at this point in time, the caps were, I think, originally $3 and then $5 million, and then $4 and then $6.5 million. None of those apply anymore. They're all gone. You can set a contract of any dollar value aside using this authority. So that hopefully will make it a little bit easier as you're reviewing the requirements that you have, that you don't have to consider the value of it in terms of potentially going this route with the program. And again, as I mentioned, competition is required. So if you're contemplating a WSB set aside or an ED WSB set aside, you need to make sure that you have 2 firms, the rule of 2 is met, and of course sole source awards are not allowed. There are some proposed pieces of legislation out there that would potentially grant a sole source authority to this program, and you'll be sure to hear about it through SBA as we update our regulations if that change is in fact put into place. So we will keep you all notified if there are changes to that. Let's start from the perspective of the women-owned small business and what the requirement is for their actions to go through the program. One of the things that they have to do is they have to represent their status, and they can do it in one of 2 ways. They can do it as a self-certification where they are like I mentioned, they go into the System for Award Management, identify their status, and they upload all their documents into the Wsb program repository, as I mentioned. And then they can go back into SAM and check the box. The other thing that they can do is they can go to a third-party certifier. And these are organizations that SBA has approved to do the third-party certification for the WOSB or the ED WSB program. From a contracting officer's perspective, if you go into the repository and you see, let's say you're going through the process and you have 2 firms that are WOSBs that have send in a bid for your requirement, and one is a third-party certifier or has represented via third-party certification, one is self-certified. There's no difference between the 2, and from your perspective, there's not a benefit to the woman-owned small business for self-certifying versus using the third-party certifier. You're supposed to give that equal weight. There's no preference there. But we'll go into more detail about the differences between that self-certification as well as the third-party certification in a few minutes. So, and again, an important clarification. As I just mentioned, this is a self-representation program. It is not an SBA official certification like the 8A program or the HubZone program. We do not have, like the 8A program and the HubZone program, where firms submit their documents and we have teams of individuals at SBA who review those applications and make an eligibility determination for those firms, and then issue a certification if they're accepted into the program. That's very different than what the WSB program allows for. In the case of the WSB program, again, it's a self-representation. SBA does not issue them a certificate. We do not, at best, the WSB repository informs the firm that they have uploaded, that they have updated their profile. We do not give them an official certification into the program like with the 8A and the HubZone program. And actually, you'll see on the slides that there are several references to the Contracting Officer's Compliance Guide. That is available at sba.gov/WOSB. And there are 2 compliance guides. There's one for women-owned small businesses or economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses that are interested in the program. And then there's a separate compliance guide for contracting officers. Pretty much everything I'm saying is well documented in the compliance guide. So if you're unable to look through this presentation or you need to have a quick reference, the compliance guide is a great resource for you, and it has a lot of questions that are done in a Q&A format throughout the entire document, and it's a very good resource for the program. So let's talk about the eligibility requirements for a few minutes. So for the WSBs out there, what does it take to qualify? The WSBs must be at least 51% owned and controlled by one or more women who are U.S. citizens, and then of course they have to satisfy a whole bunch of other requirements that are set in Part 127 of the CFR. Ownership must be direct and not subject to conditions. So that means it can't be the woman-owned small business has to be directly owned by the woman. It cannot be held by a holding company, or a portion of the firm's ownership can't be held by, or rather a majority portion cannot be held by a holding company of some sort. It has to be direct ownership by the woman. Additionally, the woman must manage day-to-day operations of the firm. So that means she has to really control the different pieces of what's going on in terms of the long-term vision for the company, and really make decisions that are essential to that firm's operation. Additionally, the firm must be at or below the small business size standard for the primary NAICS code for that business, which means that not necessarily related to the solicitation, but they must be small for the bulk of the work that they do as their for their primary code. So it's very important, obviously, to be a small business when looking at a small business program. Additionally, the firm must upload the required documents into the Wsb program repository before it can self-certify in SAM that they meet the requirements of the program. So if you are in a circumstance where you see that they've identified in SAM as a woman-owned small business that's eligible for this program, and then you take the proper steps and you go to look at their documents in the repository and they're not there, they've done something wrong in terms of just the order of the process for the program. They were supposed to upload those documents before they go back and represent their status in SAM. So we can talk about what that means in a few more minutes, but just important to know that they should be uploading their documents before making the representation and before responding to a solicitation saying that they meet the requirements. They need to have the documents uploaded. So for the economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business, the ownership and operation that we discussed for WSB holds in this case as well. But there are some additional criteria that the women-owned small business, or the woman owner of the small business, needs to meet. Primarily, the economically disadvantaged woman must own and control, again, 51% of the business and the other conditions. But then she also must have a personal net worth of less than $750,000 minus the equity in the business, equity in a primary residence, and a few other exceptions that are very important to note. And then have an adjusted annual income of less than $350,000. And overall, all of her assets cannot exceed $6 million, which includes that value of the business and the primary residence. So these are very similar to the criteria for economic disadvantage for the 8A program, so they should be familiar and are out there in many different formats for people to understand. So again, how is it determined? The personal net worth of the firm must be, or of the individual claiming economic disadvantage status must be less than $750,000, income of less than $350,000 on an annual basis, and then again, $6 million of total asset value or less. There's also an opportunity for joint ventures to respond to WSB set-asides. There are a few rules around that. Basically, that the combined receipts or number of employees must be no more than the size standard associated with the NAICS code assigned to that contract at the time of bid. Additionally, the WSB or the EDWSB must be in charge of the venture, so they must be responsible for the performance of the contract, must make the critical decisions, and must receive at least 51% of the profits. The agreement needs to be in writing, and so that is very important to have that formalized and available. And then additionally, the joint venture must meet subcontracting limitations, so to try to prevent pass-through of work. So those are the eligibility requirements. So here I think I'm now getting into the meat of the presentation. What is your role? What do you do with this program? And how do you make it work for you? So there are several steps here for how to use the WSB Federal Contract Program. And here's an important clarification before I get into these different steps. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is limited by industry. And if you have a solicitation that does not fall into one of the industries that are under this program, you and your agency can still get credit under women-owned small businesses if there is a women-owned small business that gets the work either via small business set-aside or full and open competition, or any other means. Even if it's a hub zone that's also women-owned, there's a way to, you will still get credit for women-owned small businesses. You cannot go the route of the set-aside if it is outside of these different industries that are listed on the SBA's website. So that's just an important delineation that you can still get credit outside of the program for the WSB goal, but to do a WSB set-aside, you have to follow these steps. So again, step one is determine if the solicitation is eligible for this program. And so you have to look at the NAICS code and then visit sba.gov/WOSB to look at the industries that have been designated as underrepresented or substantially underrepresented. And if there is a match there, then you can move forward with this acquisition strategy. So again, if it is on the list of underrepresented underrepresented industries, it can be set aside as an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business set aside. And if you look and the NAICS code is on the substantially underrepresented industry list, then it can be done as a WOSB set aside. So that means that either WSBs or EDWSBs can go after that contract. So next, you'll want to then conduct market research to see what's out there and see if there are in fact either women-owned small businesses or economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses that can perform the work. And then, number 7, put it out there, FBO, all the things that you do to notify potential offerers that the opportunity is out there. And then once you get your responses, you have to do the verification steps in the WSB program repository. And so we'll talk through that in a few moments, but that's a very important part of the process. You can't just move forward way that you need to do the homework in terms of verifying their documents are in the repository, et cetera. And then, of course, once you've done that, you document the file and you issue the pre-award notification to the different offerers on the contract, which opens the protest window. So a quick kind of step back as you're contemplating how to move forward with it on parity. So as established by the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010, we have parity across small business contracting programs. So what does it mean? All small business programs are equal. So a contracting officer now has the discretion to use any of those different authorities out there, or programs out there, the 8A program, the SDVOSB program, the HubZone program, or the WSB program, as well as the small business set aside. So that's important to keep in mind, that you have the option of going whichever way meets your needs in the best possible way. And then for smaller purchases under the simplified acquisition threshold, between $3,000 and less than $150,000, you have to consider those different contracting programs, WSB, SDVOSB, 8A, and HubZone, before going for a small business set aside. And of course, since those requirements are supposed to be small business set asides at that dollar value or below that dollar value, it should be you should be thinking of it anyway for those types of acquisitions. And then for over $150,000, you can consider the small business programs first, and then a generic small business set aside if you can't find a firm there, or of course full and open competition. So going back to certification in terms of self-certification versus third-party certification. As I mentioned earlier, WSBs and EDWSBs can go either way, and it doesn't make a difference to you as a contracting officer. One is not better than the other. But once they make the decision to either self-certify or to use a third-party certifier, the small business must take the necessary steps to make sure that their status is well represented in the WSB program repository, or properly represented in the WSB repository, as well as in the system for award management. So I'm going to first talk through the self-certification process, because it's a little more straightforward. What do they have to do? So first, a WSB must, or an EDWSB first must register in SAM, just like any small business or any contractor. You have to do that first. You don't get to take the next step without being in SAM. The next thing that they do is they have to access SBA's GLS system, the General Login System, to create their kind of space in the WSB program repository. And then what they need to do next is they need to complete the WSB program certification. And so what that means is that's actually more of an affidavit, and that's where some of the nomenclature gets confusing, is to call that document a certification. Businesses tend to think, oh, I've done this, therefore I am certified. Really, it's more of it's really more of an affidavit where they are saying that they are who they say they are, and also doing the financial disclosures necessary if they're an EDWSB. And so after they've done the program certification, they then need to upload the documents into the WSB repository, and I'll talk through what those documents are in just a few moments. And then any other documents that SBA may request also need to get uploaded into the repository. And then after they've done all of that, as I said, they don't get a certificate from SBA saying you are now certified. They get a thank you for updating your profile in the GLS system. And at that point, they can go back to the System for Award Management and check that they have represented their status in the WSB program repository and that they are eligible for WOSB or EDWSB set aside. So again, it's register in SAM, put the documents into the repository, and then go back to SAM and check the box to say that they've done that. For third-party certification, again, it's an optional approach. The reason that small businesses may go that route is sometimes they prefer to have other folks do some of the paperwork for them. They oftentimes charge a fee for the certification, and sometimes the fee provides benefits to the small businesses, networking events, trainings, et cetera. And so there may be a value to that. Sometimes those certifications are recognized by private sector supplier diversity programs. So if they're a small business with both commercial as well as public sector work, it might be kind of a two birds, one stone approach. But the benefits to the firm are irrelevant to us as federal employees. There's no preference in terms of self-certification or the third-party certification. It's the same destination, maybe just a different route to get there. And it's important to note that there presently are only 4 third-party certifiers out there. The El Paso Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce, the National Women's Business Enterprise National Council, and the National Women's Business Ownership Corporation. So those 4 organizations are the only ones at this time that can do the third-party certification for SBA for this program. You may have small businesses out there that have received a WBE, a Women's Business Enterprise certification from a state government or a Department of Transportation, a local government. At this time, SBA has not approved any of those other certificates as meeting the requirements for this program. So just be aware of that as you're going through the WSB program repository. At this time also, SBA is not planning or not accepting applications for new third-party certifiers, so the list is not changing at this point, but if there is a change to the list of third-party certifiers, the place to be notified or to double-check that is at sba.gov/WOSB. So what does a WSB do if they decide to go the route of third-party certification? They can first they have to register and to skip that step at any point in federal contracting, you all know that. And then they also still have to move forward with registering in the general login system and gaining access to the WSB program repository. They also need to continue to some of the similar work or some of the same work as self-certified firms do in terms of filling in the program certification documents, that affidavit that I had mentioned, Form 2413 or 2414, and if it's an EDWSB, also the Form 413 where they do the financial disclosure. So all of those must be done regardless of which route they take. And so those documents need to get uploaded into the repository. Again, same if you're self-certified versus third-party certified. The difference is instead of uploading all of the corporate documents that a self-certified firm would do, all they need to do is upload the certificate that they received from one of those authorized or approved third-party certifiers. So they can skip uploading the that I'll point out on the next page or two. Additionally, they may be requested by SBA if they're protested per se, or if a program exam to upload additional documents into the repository. But at the onset of their interest in the program, they are not required to do that. They can wait until SBA requests those documents. And again, going back to the similar, after the firm has uploaded their certificate as well as the certification forms, they then must go back to the System for Award Management and check the box saying that they have taken the steps necessary to represent themselves as eligible for this program. So they go back to SAM to do that. So I alluded to the required documents. Now I'm going to talk about the required documents. So again, for self-certification, the Wsb or the EDWSB has to upload the documents that we need as either contracting officers or at SBA doing program evaluations to make sure that they are who they say they are. So step one is those certification forms or affidavits, the 2413 or 2414, and then if it is an Wsb, the Form 413, which is the financial statement. But additionally, they need to upload several other documents, including birth certificates or naturalization papers to demonstrate that the woman owner of the firm is in fact a U.S. citizen. If there's a joint venture, they need to upload the joint venture agreement. And then the corporate documents, which are very important. So business type. If you're an LLC, you need to upload your operating agreement, the certificate of organization or the articles of organization, any amendments to any of those agreements, so that basically the legal structure of the firm needs to be uploaded into the repository, regardless of the name of the document. Similarly for corporations, articles of incorporation, any amendments to them, bylaws for the corporation, any amendments, stock certificates, a stock transfer ledger, just so that the SBA or contracting officer can determine, what is the ownership of the firm, who actually owns that. Any voting agreements where that dictate how the board of directors operate the company, anything that impacts the ability of the firm to make decisions legally. And then for partnerships, again, similarly, the partnership agreement, any amendments to them, and then any assumed name documents. And actually, I believe that holds true for any of the business types, not partnerships, but just basically demonstrating what the firm is and how the firm, or who the firm is rather, in terms of who the woman-owned small business or the woman business owner is, and her citizenship, as well as who is operating the firm and how they operate the firm via the legal documents that are listed out on this slide. So a different route again is that third-party certification. If the firm chooses to go the route of the third-party certification, they don't need to upload corporate documents right away. They may need to if they're protested or if SBA requests them. In this case, as a third-party certified company, all they need to do is upload the certificate from that organization, as well as the affidavit forms that I mentioned, and the personal financial statement if it is an EDWSB. And of course, if it's a joint venture, then the joint venture agreement. So that's it might be a little bit less of a burden on the small business to just upload these documents, but in effect, it's the same amount of work for the small business. They still need to send all those documents in order to get the eligibility determination from the third-party certifier. So it's just a matter of where the firm wants to put the information. So again, moving back to kind of the role of the contracting officer and how as a contracting officer you'll interact with the WOSB and the program repository. So the program repository is an important tool in this program. Again, it's where all those documents go where the women-owned small businesses are demonstrating their eligibility for the program. And so it is critical to the operation program. It's online, so you can access it. That makes it much easier than having any other format these days. And it's important for you to understand what your role is in the picture of this program. So you, as a contracting officer that's elected to make an acquisition using the strategy, needs to visit the program repository to review the documentation of the WSB that you'd like to award the contract to and affirm the representation of eligibility prior to the contract award. So we'll talk more about what that means as well. So with reviews and protests, It's an important part of this program as well. SBA has the right to do what we call eligibility examinations. We look at both self-certified firms as well as third-party certified firms on a regular basis just to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of uploading the right documents and actually being who they say they are in the Wsb repository. So sometimes we run into the circumstance as we're doing an eligibility examination where we find that a firm is not eligible, and if that is the case, we ask them to remove their as such in the Wsb repository as well as in the system for award management. Of course, the firm can always change their circumstances and become eligible for the program again, so they can make those steps and make those corrections and then re-represent. So it's really a moment in time. But it's critical that officer, you understand that they're making that representation to you at the time that they're responding to the solicitation, that they are who they say they are. So that's the moment in time that's most relevant to you all. And then, of course, a protest is where you, if you are looking at a woman-owned small business that's responded, have a suspicion that maybe they are not who they say they are. So you, as a contracting officer, are an interested party in terms of you may protest a woman-owned small business that's responding to one of your contracts, or you may find that another small business that's responded to the solicitation can protest. And of course, SBA can protest as needed. Again, the protest policies are, again, well represented or well discussed in the compliance guide. So there are a couple of slides now where there are just some resources listed, most of which I've talked about. And then there's an addendum where I'll walk through the WSB program repository. And I think that is something that Teresa and her colleagues have asked me to kind of spend a few minutes on, as the repository itself. But I already talked about the compliance guide. I already talked about the different certification forms that the firms need to fill out, where the third-party certifiers are listed. I mean, the vast majority of this is available at that very last link at sba.gov/WOSB. You all already know that tax and on the next slide, like our resource partners for SBA, the small business development centers and the women's business centers, are great information about the WSB program, as well as our district offices. Another resource that's not listed on this slide is our government contracting classroom. So at gov/GC classroom, and the GC stands for government contracting. There are different courses about different contracting programs, including this one. There's a training for contracting officers as well as WSBs, and they're basically what we're doing today, but they're self-paced. So if I went too fast way back on slide 15, you can go back and repeat that in the GC class. With a very similar course to this one as we're going through it today. So again, that's sba.gov/GC classroom to get there directly, or you can go to sba.gov and click around into the Learning Center and pull up the government contracting courses that are there. Again, not limited to the WSB program, but also the 8A program, SDB OSB program, non-manufacturer waivers, all sorts of interesting things. We're working on new courses that are coming up, include certificates of competency. We expect to have that done before the end of the calendar year, and a few other courses that are interesting to contracting officers. And then a last kind of point on contacting us. You can call us at 1-800-YOU-ASK-SBA, or you can email WOSB@SBA. Another great resource for you in the acquisition community is your procurement center representative, also listed on sba.gov under the contracting section. If you don't know your PCR already, you can definitely look up who they are, either by geography or by agency. And so they're happy to answer your questions. They work for my office, and available to help you all navigate any of the issues that you're having, and certainly can work with you on this particular program, especially because compared to some of the other programs, it is very, very new, and the rules have changed already in the past 3 years a couple of different times. So they're definitely well versed at at this program, getting the questions about this program, and then finding additional resources to answer your question if they don't have it. So again, the Procurement Center representative at sba.gov under the contracting section in the government field staff directory. So now we'll just take a quick walk through the Wsb repository. And actually, you can't get to the repository without making a visit to our GLS system. So to register for a GLS account, the link is there on the website. You have to go to https://eweb.sba.gov/GLS. Also be easier just to Google SBA GLS. It'll take you here. So there are a couple of different links on that site which are helpful. There's an instructions list on the left, rather, so that'll help you kind of remember some of these steps if they, if you don't have this presentation handy or I'm not on the phone with you. But another thing that you'll have to do if you haven't used GLS before, you'll have to click on that link to the left that is Request Sba User Id. And that's a very important step. You can't get into GLS or the repository without it. And so I'm going to walk through that request. So you get to the site and it has your user ID and password. You don't have a user ID. So then you click on the link on the left and it takes you to this page where it immediately prompts you for the user ID. Now this is a little bit confusing because usually, or with many different experiences on the web, it'll tell you what you should use for your user ID, or it automatically generates one for you. This is not the case. You have to create your own, and you just do it by putting in the user ID that you want into that top box that says user ID. So it's a little bit confusing in that regard. It's also important not to use special characters with it, particularly ampersands or exclamation points or things like that, because this is an older system and it interferes with some of the coding if you use some of the characters that coders use to build websites or used a few years ago when this website was built. So you may want to stay away from your email address. I know that as a government person, most of my things are my first name dot last name at sba.gov, but in this case you want to stay away from your email address because of the special characters that might be in it. So you create your own user ID there, and as you fill in the different fields, you might get frustrated because it won't let you put in which state you're in. If you fill in the zip code field, it will populate the state for you. So it's a little bit quirky in getting through this form, but once you get through it, before you submit, you have to make sure that you tell it who you are in terms of your role. So as you fill out the different pieces of information, you'll select job title. Make sure you select contracting officer, in fact, if you are in fact a contracting officer, and select your agency as well so that we know who you are and why you're requesting access. So once you do that and select your username and tell us who you are, you'll get an email with your temporary password so you can log in, as well as it'll prompt you to create a permanent password. So that's how you get to start with GLS. So you request your password, or you request your ID, it sends you a temporary password, and then you go back to the general GLS login screen. So that's where you put in your minted user ID. You first put in your temp password, and then you'll get prompted to change it to a permanent one. And once you've successfully done that, you will be brought to the terms and conditions page. If you do not agree, you cannot access the system, but read all the fine print, and then you're in. So, but you're not all the way there yet. So what you have to do to get access. So GLS is a system for SBA work. You can access many different systems depending on who you are as a user and what your role is. So before you, as a contracting officer from another agency, can access the WSB program repository, you need to first click on Access at the top of the GLS system to request access to the WSB repository. And so you can select that, and you can select your role, and then you will request the by pressing the submit button. Once approved, you get to log back into the GLS system, and you'll see at that point when you log in that the WSB program repository is listed as your option. Generally, it is your only option as a contracting officer from another agency, and so you just click through on that to get access to it. Then, of course, you have a disclaimer, and talks about what the program is and what it isn't, and how to use the repository. There is a help function there as well on the top of the screen. Another place to get help with the repository, again, is emailing that wosb@sba.gov email address. We know the right people to go to if it's a technical problem versus if it's a understanding of the program problem. It's kind of two different set of folks that would answer your question. So we can make sure that the right people are getting your question and get it answered for you at that email address. So again, you go through the disclaimer. Once you are in, you'll see the different firms listed that have granted you access to the repository. So this is very important in terms of the number of firms that may be out there, or in there for you. You have to, as you're going through the solicitation process and firms are responding to the solicitation as a WSB, they will have to also grant you access to the WSB repository information for their firm. So if you log in and you do not see, if you click on Business View in the center and you see any firms populate, that means that the WSBs that are supposed to grant you access have not yet granted you access to review their documents. So make sure that once you provide them notice of the award, before that, make sure that as they're responding as WSBs, that you are requesting access to their documents in the WSB repository. So again, you have to ask them for access, and they need to grant you access to the repository so you can see, or rather their information within the repository so they can see your information. And then you can view it in two forms. You can do the business view, or you can do it by the solicitation. And so there are two different views of that. I skipped a slide, I'm sorry. So this is the solicitation view. Again, it's in the middle of the top part of how to either do it by the businesses or by the solicitation. And either way, you'll get to the, once you get to the actual profile for that individual firm, you'll see a list of all their documents that they have ever uploaded to the repository. And you can then click through, review the documents, and see that the firm is in fact who they say they are. And so that is, again, that's an important function that you have to perform as a contracting officer, is going through those documents and make sure that they're all there. And what we would recommend is, or rather a word of caution is, once a firm uploads a document to the repository, they can't delete it. So if you see something that doesn't make sense in the repository, understand that the firm has no ability to upload it. So you might see like corporate bylaws, and you might see corporate bylaws new. Like you have to determine which one is the right file for the firm, because if they uploaded the wrong document the first time that they tried, there's no function to delete that. So that's sometimes complicated, and why you might see something listed multiple times if they had trouble with the upload. So then again, there's Solicitation View, which brings up the different solicitations that you might have active, and you can click through on that, and then you'll see authorized access under that kind of view, and then you'll be able to review their documents there as well. So that's a quick walkthrough of the WSB program repository. And again, with the repository, if you do not see the firm there, they have not yet provided you access. And so you need to ask them to, again, go back to the firm and say, hey, we really need to do it in order to be able to review your documents and make sure you're eligible for the program and can get the award.
All right.
I'm through.
Extremely helpful, very detailed. I learned a lot myself. I myself, and I'm a former SBA, didn't know where and how to get to the repository. So I hope all of you contracting officials found this to be extremely helpful. So although I found it to be very detailed, let's see if you got any questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so far, no questions. So, while we're waiting, Aditi, I actually had a couple of questions.
I'm sure these are the tough ones.
These are the easy ones. These are the easy ones. Okay, so on the goals and credit towards the goals. So I can do, whether a contracting officer awards a set aside, or if they don't, I can still get credit as a federal agency?
Right. So it's important to keep in mind, well, when you look at SAM, there are a lot of different options for being a woman-owned small business in SAM these days. There, I think, might be 6 or 7 options. There's woman-owned business, there's woman-owned small business, and then now there are these additional categories of, I am a woman-owned small business that is eligible for, and it has a citation. I'm an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business and I am eligible for. And then there's, I think, even a JV one. So there's that's at least 5 statuses that I just came up with off the top of my head, and I'm not looking right at it. So you can still get credit for the firms that are just woman-owned small businesses. They've just checked the box in SAM, but you can't, without having to go through the process of setting aside the contract with this program. And that's more broad in terms of the industries that you can get credit for.
Okay.
And so if you are in if the contract is in one of the industries where this program is allowed, or you can use this authority, then I would definitely recommend going with the WSB set aside if you know that there are 2 women-owned small businesses out there that can do it, just so you can be assured of getting that credit. You know, if you do a general small business set aside, you might get a different set of respondents, and you might end up not being able to make an award to a woman-owned small business. It might be just a generic small business or something like that. So hopefully that clarifies the what do I do when.
It
there are a lot
does
of
indeed.
statuses.
So thank you, Dee Dee. All right, so we have a couple of questions. Let's start. Is any evaluation information available on the strengths of each of the third-party certifiers?
That's a great question. So I said it several times during the presentation that from a contracting perspective or a government perspective, we don't give weight to one third-party certifier over another versus self-certification. So that it doesn't really matter to us because there is no benefit, you know, one way or another. If I rephrase the question just a little bit, the question might be a little bit more of what are the benefits from one third-party certifier versus another. Like, why would a small business get certified from a third-party certifier? And actually, you know, SBA hasn't consolidated any of that information of what the benefits are in terms of applying for those certifications, but I do know that there are some differences in the benefits that are offered by those four different organizations. For example, the Women's Business Enterprise Council does not do the ED WSB certification. They just do the WSB certification. The reason that they say is because they certify firms, not individuals. And so to look at the economic disadvantage of an individual, you know, that would be outside of their purview as an organization. But I would highly recommend visiting each of the or if you're working with a woman-owned small business and they don't know what to do, they should look at each of those 4 organizations, and we have the links live at sba.gov/WOSB so they can see what the benefits are, and depending on the organization, you know, they might have sub-organizations, and there could be different benefits based even geographically on where you are. And of course, with benefits typically come fees, and so you may pay more, but you may also get more. And it really, it's such a personal decision for the firm that without, you know, I would never, as a federal employee, find myself advising, oh, you should go here versus there, because it's such a personal decision for the entrepreneur.
It is indeed. Very good. Thank you, Aditi. So here's an interesting question. Can you register in GLS as a core instead of a contracting officer?
So I believe you can get access to the repository in several different roles. Again, kind of looking at what is the question behind the question. If you're a core, you might be thinking, maybe I'm going to use the WSB repository to do some market research. Discourage that. So the WSB repository, the reason why we discourage that is that the repository is where firms that are really, really, really interested in government contracting have already gone and done a lot of the steps that they need to do in order to win a federal contract. You limit your market research to just looking at the repository, you're going to leave out all the firms that are in DSBS, that are in the broader ecosystem out there that could potentially be doing work for you as an agency. So you might not you might not have very successful market research if you limit to the WSB repository, and that's the main reason from discouraging it. But for this question, as well as, I mean, it looks like there are several now. If there are anything, I'll definitely get a clarification from my folks back at SBA and make sure that you know, we can somehow get that information out to the audience. But I'll verify that for you all.
So for now, as we tell contracting officers to use the SBA Dynamic Small Business Search as well as SAM when they're conducting market research.
Absolutely.
And your agency's cognizant small business specialists to assist with the market research.
Absolutely.
So, all right. So, here's a great question, Aditi. Do you know if GSA will add EDWOSB to the set-aside choices list under the GSA eBuy?
You know, we work very closely in my office, in the Office of Government Contracting, with GSA on all sorts of things, all the systems that they manage. And I know, for example, we just, not to change subjects, but we worked very long and hard to get the changes made to allow for set-asides for task orders under multiple award contracts. And there needed obviously to be systems with the new authority in order to make that happen, and it took a long time to make that happen, but now that's available. Again, this program's really new, so it wouldn't surprise me if right now it's not a choice. I personally don't know that we have had those conversations, or I haven't been part of them, is more likely what's happening.
Okay.
But I will definitely check into that, because it's a good option now to have the program, and so we should make sure that ED, WSB, and WSB under this program is allowed.
Well, definitely. And especially since a lot of agencies spend the majority or the bulk of their year-end money
on the schedule,
using the GSA schedule, it's a great way to capture that category.
That is a great recommendation. So if it's not happening, it will be happening very soon.
Very good, very good. So the question regarding a copy of the presentation, if you're looking at the slides right now, if you're looking at the webinar right now, if you look to the right of the speakers, there's a blue note that says speakers presentation slides, and if you click on that, you can get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. But we will also upload this webinar as well as the PowerPoint into FAI, so you'll be able to access it there too. So I received a question on, do you have to submit a small business review for a women-owned small business set-aside, the small business review form, which you know that all of the small business offices are required to conduct a small business review. So let me address at HHS. No, at HHS, if you are going to do a set-aside for a woman-owned small business, no, you do not have to submit here we call it a 653. We have the automated system now, the small business review system. Several agencies have different form numbers, such as DOD has a 2579, and I know that Homeland Security and all of the other federal agencies have some other number or a nomenclature for their form. So at HHS, it is not required. And the PCRs are not required to review any procurement that's being set aside for a small business. So here, it's not exempt.
Yeah.
So,
and I would imagine that it depends on the agency.
It depends on the federal agency.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, all right. So next question, does FAR Part 19 cover all information regarding the Women-Owned Small Business Program?
Yeah, so I'm not going to lie, I haven't read every single word in the FAR. But I do know that there are some discrepancies sometimes between what SBA regulations say and what the FAR says, just in general, as that process takes place. So I'm pretty confident that the vast majority of the different requirements are in the FAR, but I do know that there are areas where the SBA regulations might be a little more specific or have a little more detail. So I would definitely recommend reviewing both as you're getting familiar with the program.
Yeah.
And it's just good practice in general, because sometimes the way things are worded in one versus the other are slightly different, and it's sometimes very important to know those disparities so that you can understand, where do you need more information, where to take the next step. So have read the SBA regs on this program, though. They're pretty painless as far as regs go. They're not super duper long, and they are pretty straightforward. So, it might be worth it, especially if you're interested in getting started with this program or doing it for the first time. Spend an hour or two just perusing it, and it'll mind at rest.
So the site, even though you have it referenced in your slides for the SBA regulations, but can you tell them again?
Yeah, Part 127, or Section 127.
So, Title 13 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Section
127.
127.
Yeah,
Very
and that's
good.
on slide 3
Okay.
as well.
Very good. Thank you, Aditi. All right, so next question. When using the WSB program to award a contract, is credit issued through SBA? And I know that we addressed that once before, but if you'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, we at SBA, we all of the agency's performance as we are reviewing the scorecard and getting the scorecard prepared, and so SBA ultimately is the one that kind of aggregates and provides the performance to Congress in our report annually, and so technically we are the ones that do it, but if you do a WSB set aside, your agency definitely gets credit for it, so that's a very good thing.
Okay. Great. So we received a question. I know that you've addressed it, but we'll go ahead and ask the question, and that is, what are the dollar thresholds for the WSB program?
Great. I did mention this. Initially, when the program was established, there were dollar caps on the amount of the dollar value of the award that could be set aside. As of early 2013, those caps have been removed, so they're no longer in place. The are no caps any longer. So, we are still updating different pieces of information out there. So you may even see on an SBA.gov site in some corner of our website that those caps are still referenced. The latest and greatest news is that they are not eligible, or there are no restrictions at the dollar value of the contract any longer. So that's the truth right there. You heard it from me.
Well, actually, I think that's a great thing.
Absolutely.
So very good, and that will allow us to use more women-owned small businesses within the federal market space. So I think that's great.
It definitely adds a lot more flexibility to the program and more applicability.
It
for
does,
it.
And less confusing for the acquisition personnel. So this is an interesting question. Can you discuss the SBA offering letter or core letter process for these types of set-asides?
So to me that reads as if it's kind of an 8A kind of question.
Yeah.
So we don't have that type of process, and actually this is your background. I don't know if you want to take it, but
I mean, you're right on the money. The fact is that there's an offering letter is not required for the Women-Owned Small Business Program. So you can go through the process that Aditi shared with you here today, and you don't have to go to SBA at all. Just award to the women-owned small businesses. Right.
So you just need to take the steps of, if your market research says that there are women-owned small businesses out there, it's in the right industry, go ahead and do the WSP set-aside. And then once you get those responses to that RFP, then you do need to go to the repository and verify that the documents are there, but that's it. So, it's a little bit easier, I guess.
It is much easier, but also though it has to still be within one of those industries.
Right. So there is that industry restriction.
So that's the caveat. And my recommendation is always look at what your agency's goals are, and taking into consideration parity. Most certainly, if their rule of 2 applies, we want you to award to women-owned small businesses.
Absolutely.
All right? Okay, very good. So next question. What if a woman-owned small business is awarded a contract and lose their status? What is the government's recourse, or how are we to handle this matter of a firm losing their status?
So that is a question, because it's all about that moment in time, right?
Yes.
And so if at there's supposed to be a WSB at several important junctures. One, when they make the representations in the system for award management. As they're checking the boxes, they're supposed to be who they say they are. They're supposed to have uploaded their documents in the repository. So that's one moment in time where they're supposed to be meeting the criteria for the program. And then again, there's that moment in time where they're responding to the solicitation. They're supposed to meet the eligibility requirements at that time.
Okay.
And so if a circumstance where you award the contract is being performed and the woman-owned small business loses status, that's something that you'll need to talk to SBA about, because it really does matter about the moment in time. And if it's in that time where they've responded to the solicitation but you haven't yet completed the contract award, that's a place where you're probably supposed to be protesting, especially as a contracting officer. You'd want to do the protest. But really, that's a good place for you to work with SBA on, you thought you had your acquisition strategy all figured out and now something's gone wrong. That's what we're here for. Please call us.
Well, I think, Aditi, it's no different than any other small business category. So so that if a firm loses its status, let's say that a large company buys that small business out, or let's say that the small business actually outgrows its small business size status, then you need to contact the SBA area office, because if there's a size challenge for the size protest, or if there is a challenge on the status, then the SBA area office is the one that you should contact. And a list of those area offices are actually on the SBA website at sba.gov/GC.
Yeah, exactly. So shout out to SBA. It's good.
All right, very good. So next question. Do WOSBs need to use WOSB subcontractors? That's a great question.
That's a great question. So, in general, no, but specific. I mean, there are subcontracting goals. So, ideally, all prime contractors would use a diversity of subcontractors to help meet subcontracting goals. I think that's the generic answer. Some new regulations that maybe you've heard a little bit about in terms of similarly situated firms performing work on a contract. So that's helpful.
So do you want to allude to that a little further?
I mean, basically, my problem is I don't remember off the top of my head where we are in the regulatory I think it's a proposed rule out for comment now. If but I might be. And again, I'll provide the most up-to-the-minute information to Teresa to send out to everyone after this. But basically, if you are if Teresa and I own our own firms and we're both WOSBs, we're going after a contract, I can only do 30% of the work. She can do 30% of the work. That gets us over the threshold of being able to do the majority of the work. So we're good to go. And that's the layman's way of explaining it. It's the way I understand it. So, and that's a really great rule.
And Aditi, you alluded to the majority of the work. So the limitations on subcontracting rules still apply for the women-owned small business set aside. So those requirements, the 50-50, I think it's 15 and 10 for construction, those rules still apply. So under the woman-owned small business set aside program, you still have those requirements that a small business has to meet. So in that case, where you have similarly situated small businesses, it allows them to meet that limitations on subcontracting requirement. So,
much more eloquent, thank you.
Teamwork.
Teamwork, so, and that actually the similarly situated thing is around teaming for contracts, but that also works.
And I think that's a great. So, can a contracting specialist register in the SBA repository? If so, is it done through the same link? And also, can you repeat the link?
Flipping through my presentation to get to that link.
Okay.
But yeah, so a contracting, even if you're not in the throes of a solicitation right now and you want to just get the process done to get access to the repository, you are proactive, and I like it. It's a good strategy.
So you highly recommend
that.
So
I say that's great because it does take you a few, I don't want to say a few days, but there is a delay between when you request access to the repository to when you can access the repository. It takes somebody manually checking the box saying Teresa can have access. So
very good.
Definitely good to be proactive about it. If you run into issues, I know this is a busy time of year for everyone, so it is very important to kind of get these things taken care of. And it's at https://eweb.sba.gov/GLS. Again, Google GLS SBA, and it'll take you right there. So that's another kind of quick way to get there.
Very good. So Aditi, someone has asked the question that actually I had on my mind. And that is, are there advantages to using a certifier?
Again, for a firm, there might be. So just from my knowledge of the different third-party certifiers, they offer all sorts of different programs to the firm. Some of them do advocacy work. Some of them do, private sector coordination. So private companies, just like the government, have supplier diversity programs where, the Fortune 1000 says we want to make sure that our supply base matches our consumer base, and so they have, a value of we want to procure from women-owned small businesses, minority-owned small businesses, etc. So some of those third-party certifiers serve those large, for us, prime contractors. in order to help small businesses get contracts with them in the private sector as well here in the public sector. So there are a whole suite of benefits that the different third-party certifiers offer to the small businesses in terms of access to those kinds of opportunities with the private sector. Advocacy work, training on how to do business, how to write a business plan, all sorts of different stuff for the benefit of the business owner. So there are definitely benefits to small businesses that might be of interest to them, but they still have to go through the same steps in terms of they have to send somebody their documents. Either they're uploading it to Sba directly into the repository, or they're sending that same stack of paper plus a check to the third-party certifier. So when it comes to is there a benefit of one path versus another, I can't say. I don't think necessarily there is one. It really does depend on the individual firm.
Okay, very good. So, question regarding market research. What is the best way for a core to find WSB for market research?
Great. So we referenced a few minutes ago the dynamic small business search. That information is popular system for award management, and that's an SBA system. It is a good tool for market research. It is not the newest tool for small business research, but it is definitely available and a good way to kind of narrow the field down by industry, by industry, and by business type and keyword searches. All of that is available on DSBS and a good resource. I think you did point out an excellent resource, which is your Office of Small Business Programs, because I know that they're out there every day. We're planning another event to do small business outreach, particularly to women-owned small businesses. So they know that there are literally hundreds, if not businesses out there lining up to do business with the federal government, or specifically with you. And so the small business specialists at your agency are a good resource. Our SBA's Procurement Center representatives also oftentimes know firms and can help with a specific solicitation. So I would recommend them. I don't know if you have other places where you'd want to point. Sam?
No,
Sam is a good one.
I think that's really good. I think also the women trade associations. There are several of those that are out there. I think you've mentioned a couple during this presentation, and there were some that you have included on your slide. So no, I really think that that's very comprehensive.
Right, and I'll kind of plug one of the items that I work on. We work on SBA works with Women Impacting Public Policy and American Express Open on a series of outreach events called the Challenge Her Initiative. And this is specifically around this program where we've done these different events to invite the public in and to get an understanding of the criteria for the program, how to, what is the WSB repository, how do you do business with a federal agency. It's pretty basic information that we've been getting out there, but it is a campaign to really raise awareness of this program and that broadly women have opportunities within the federal supply chain. And so last year we hosted an event at HHS. Wonderful. We
had over 200
participants. Yeah, it was one of the best ones out there. And we've done it at other federal agencies as well. And then SBA, as you may or may not know, has our district office structure. We have nearly 70 district offices across the country, and we've hosted events at those offices as well. So particularly if you're outside the Beltway, go make friends with your local SBA district office, because they're going to have their connections within the community as well and know many small businesses. They may walk in the door expecting to get assistance with a business plan. They may have never contemplated the government as a potential client. And you may have a need for whatever it is that they're producing. So definitely reach out to the district office as well and partner with them.
Okay, very good. So Aditi, question, is a contracting officer, is it a requirement for a contracting officer to check the repository before making a award, or can award be based on information in SAM?
So you should be going into the repository. It is a requirement for you to go and check and make sure that everything is there. And what is the standard that you use, though? Are you looking at business plan or business legal documents every day? Are you an expert as a contracting officer in what an appropriate, articles of organization for an LLC is? What does that look like? You're not. So what do you do? When you're in the repository, what we recommend is just to take a look and see if anything is out of place. If you've looked at their SAM profile and you see that Teresa here is representing as the owner of the company, but you see that the lead contact name is Tom, Jerry, you know, that might be an issue. And if you then go into the legal documents and you see, you know, you'll see it on the top page or maybe the second page of a legal document referring of the firm that the of the firm is actually this guy named Tom. That might be an issue. And so in that case, we're not asking you to say, I'm not going to use this firm, we're asking you to protest. So submit a protest for that firm. So that we're just asking you to take a look, and if something seems wrong,
yes,
make sure we know. And let me step back to the program exams that we're doing. We have a methodology for selecting which firms get the program evaluation, and the best way for me to say it is there is a strong likelihood that if you are awarded a contract under this program, you'll be selected for that program exam. So that's another way that we're monitoring the program to see if firms, as well as contracting officers, are doing what they're doing. So the short answer is yes. You should be logging into the repository to review the documents. No, we don't expect you to be an expert on determining the eligibility of the firm. But if you do see something strange, you should definitely let us know via a protest. And you know, if you're not sure of what to do, again, that's a place to engage a PCR or somebody from our Office of Contract Assistance or the WSB program to help us help you get through the solicitation. We definitely want to encourage you. So if you're already down the path on a solicitation with this, and you might feel like, oh no, you know, I went out with this strategy and now I'm looking at these two different firms and I have concerns about them, we will work with you to find a way to make that happen, you know, in a way that's of course legal and appropriate. So we want this program to be successful. We know that it's a little bit of a unique animal, but please do work with us and understand we are very willing to work with you to help you get to the right place on that particular solicitation.
So now, Aditi, based on the comments you made, if I'm not awarding a small business set aside, but I am awarding to a woman-owned small business, do I have to, as a contracting officer, go into the repository?
If you've done it as in the scenario you just laid out, it's not WSB
not a
set aside.
Correct.
So you don't have to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, and if a woman-owned small business, do they have to upload the information into the system even if they're not pursuing set-aside opportunities?
So,
or they're not in any of the industries that would qualify them to participate?
So that's a great question. There is no requirement for the WSB to upload their documents until actually they've responded to the WSB set-aside solicitation. So that's pretty late in the game, actually. So you may get to a circumstance where a woman has responded and you think that, or a woman-owned small business has responded and you think you might be awarding her the contract. She actually has, I think it's 5 days to get all those documents in there for you to review and grant you access to the repository to review her documents. So it's actually very late in the game where she can. We at SBA recommend that they do it a little more proactively, as some have indicated. Being proactive is good, and so we encourage women-owned small businesses, if they're eligible and think they'll be pursuing the set-asides, to go ahead and upload their documents.
So Aditi, as a contracting official, should they email the women-owned small businesses that they if their information is not in the repository, that hey, I need you to, or if it is in there, either way, I need you to grant me access to the information in the repository? Or is there language in the clause that states that? How does that work?
So in terms of getting access to the repository, that's in the notification that's part of kind of your response to the responses that you're getting. So if you put it out as a WSB set aside and you get the request, you get the responses, that's when you get access to the repository. And I believe we do have some language on that. I'll see if I can provide that on how to get access to the repository. So I'll make a note of that.
So, not to put you on the spot, but this seems like an extra step for this program that you don't have for the others. What's the benefit of having the repository, Aditi?
So, that is one of the unique challenges of the program. It is different from the HubZone program and the 8A program, as I mentioned, where SBA is doing the validation of those firms. basically, if you see the check mark in SAM, or I guess the SBS is the official system of record, and it says it's a hub zone or it's an 8A, there is no way for that check mark to get there unless either a system error or SBA has put it there or authorized for it to be there. This is different because of the way the legislation is written. It is a self-certification, so the firm should have the option to check the box. And this repository and this methodology that SBA developed was our best attempt to make this be the way it should be in terms of providing an avenue for us to do, we as not just SBA but the acquisition community, to do the validation that's required for the firm. So that is the challenge there, is that it is an extra in terms of having the contracting officer need to do the validation. But the benefit is to make sure, like I said in one of the examples we talked about earlier, is if you are kind of keying in on making the WSB goal and you've used the principle of parity, to limit competition to WSB's guarantees that you'll be able to award the contract to a WSB. And so that's the benefit there in terms of being able to balance your awards and make the different goals that are set. So.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Dee. So here's a question. In light of the dollar thresholds being removed, are there additional changes being advocated for the program? Are the included NAICS codes subject to change? Okay, so how about we address the first part, the second part?
Okay. Additional changes to the program. Right now, that dollar cap removal, we were able to implement that very quickly, as I mentioned, and it's very helpful in terms of improving the flexibility of the program. In terms of other changes, the main one that's being kicked around right now is the sole source authority for the program. Currently, there is no sole source authority. When you look at all of the other small business contracting programs, 8A has a very special sole source authority, but also SDV, OSB, and HubZone has sole source authority. There are different proposals out there on the Hill regarding adding a sole source authority to this program. SBA, in work with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, we've been able to come out and say that we actually support the legislation that is out there to add a sole source authority to the program. Just a matter of executive legislative functions running their course. So we don't know when that change will be or if that change will be made by Congress. If so, if that change is made, we will work, SBA will work again quickly to try to get that, and then work very closely with the FAR Council to get it added to the FAR. But I have absolutely no prediction as to when that could happen.
Okay.
But that's what the Federal Register is for.
Okay, very good.
And the second part of the question?
So the second part, and actually I have a question that's related. So I'll ask them together, and they're all related to the NAICS code. So are the included NAICS codes subject to change, or include additional NAICS codes in the future to reflect changes in the economy? Now that's that question, but then there's another question on, are the limitations going to be removed?
Okay, great question. So we currently are operating with about 300 some odd, I think it's 360, 370, 330, some number greater than of the 6-digit NAICS codes that are eligible for the program. And those industries were chosen or designated, I guess is probably the word, based on a study that was conducted, SBA contracted out and had conducted, and that was, the result of the study was we found that women were underrepresented in those industries. I believe it was the National Defense Act of 2013, with the cap removal, SBA was also mandated to redo that study, to re-examine the NAICS codes that were eligible for the program, and we were given a timeline of up to 5 years to do that. So that would make it by fiscal 18, I think we needed to have it done. We had already missed the budgetary cycle for FY13 at that point, and also for 14. So we had put in a request for, or excuse me, we were well into FY13 when that happened, and so we had already missed the budget cycle, and we're planning on putting it in for fiscal 16 for us to do that study. When our new administrator came into office, we talked about it, and she said we shouldn't wait on that, and so we've bumped it up and anticipate doing the solicitation for the new study and the contractor to do that study in FY15. And so we have to go through a full acquisition to redo the study and to have the study conducted in FY15. Again, with the acquisition cycle taking some time and needing to give the contractor the appropriate amount of time to do the work, I'm not sure when we would have the result of that study, but we do have that in place, or we are starting right now to work on that and to make that happen. I imagine come November of this year, we'll have a better time frame in terms of what does the statement of work for that look like, when do we expect the study to be completed, and then we would know from that point if there will be changes to the codes that are involved for the program. In terms of will they just be removed in its entirety? That's a more challenging question. The limitation by industry was to ensure that the program was constitutional, frankly, and so there are lots of different reasons and lots of different lots of background into why the program was structured this way, but I don't anticipate, again, barring a legislative change of some sort, that the requirement to limit it by industry would be changed anytime in the near future.
Because I remember when they were in the process of developing this program, the conversation centered around what are the industries where women are at a disadvantage.
Exactly.
And that was the purpose for establishing this program and setting up those parameters so that you could allow competition amongst those women and give them that additional benefit where they may not have had that advantage previously.
Correct.
And so that was the purpose, at least from that I can recall. They established it with those limiting industries, and it goes back to a lot of the census data and and all of the other studies that you've talked about. So very good. All right, so Aditi, I have one last question, and it appears that it was addressed to me. So when I talked about the small business review, I obviously gave some confusing and conflicting information. So just so that I clarify for those of you here at the Department of Health and Human Services. So the small business review, over $25,000 but below the simplified acquisition threshold of $150,000, a 653 is required for all actions. It, however, is not required as a small business set aside to be reviewed by the SBA PCR. At the threshold of $50,000, the SBA PCR will review all actions that are not being set aside for small business. So I hope that clarifies things. If not, please contact your small business specialist. And I just want to say, on any of the small business areas, any of the small business categories, if you have any small business question, regardless of the agency where you're located, please contact your small business specialist. Here at HHS, we have a website. It's hhs.gov/small business. If you don't know who your small business specialist is, all federal agencies have a similar type small business office website. And if you don't know that web address, go to osdbu.gov, and all of the federal agencies' small business offices are listed there. Aditi, thank you so much. I've received several compliments from individuals saying how thorough this program is and how thorough your presentation is, how detailed it answers a lot of questions, and the kudos go on and on. So I too share the same sentiment. Extremely helpful, and especially for the acquisition personnel, just knowing what they need to do, what their roles and responsibilities are, is going to go a long way towards the federal government meeting and exceeding their small business woman-owned goals. So thank you again for taking time out of your hectic and busy day to just come and share and help me with providing training to HHS and the other federal agencies that have chosen to join us today.
Well, thank you so much, and to everyone watching, just remember that SBA is here as a resource, as well as your Wsb office or Teresa's office here at HHS. Please do reach out. You're not alone in this, and we are definitely more than happy to continue to help.
All right. And again, the presentation will be uploaded in FAI. So for those of you that did not get a chance to register in FAI, we will provide the listing to them so that you can get your 1.5 CLPs. I thank you all so much for joining us today.